London, October 2007. Adele Adkins was 19 years old and still carried the smell of fresh ink on her first contract with XL Recordings. Her debut album was being finalized, and she was, for the vast majority of the British music industry, a promising but as yet unproven name. She walked down the corridor of Metropolis Studios in Chiswick with a coffee in her hand and the sheet music of a new song folded in the pocket of her jacket. It was a Thursday night, and the studio was busier than usual. Cars she didn't recognize were parked outside. A black Mercedes, a taxi with the door still open, a van with equipment that wasn't hers. She entered through reception and greeted Danny, the night security guard who always worked evenings. "It's packed today," she said, signing the entry book. Danny nodded with a strange smile, as if he knew something she didn't. "Amy's here. Arrived an hour ago with the new producer." Adele stopped. Amy Winehouse was here. The Amy Winehouse, the woman who had released Back to Black just a year earlier and had transformed British music in a way no one could yet fully measure. The woman whose name appeared in every magazine, on every radio show, in the mouth of every producer Adele had spoken to over the past 6 months. Every one of them, at some point, had said the same thing in different ways. "You have something special, but Amy is Amy." Adele felt that familiar tightness in her stomach. It wasn't exactly envy. It was something more complicated, a mixture of genuine admiration with the painful awareness that, at that moment, she was living in the shadow of someone who didn't even know she existed. She went to the recording booth they had reserved for her and began working with her sound engineer, a Scotsman named Bryce, who spoke little and listened a lot. They were refining a track that didn't yet have a definite name, a ballad about loss that Adele had written in the early hours 3 weeks earlier after a difficult conversation with her mother. 40 minutes later, the corridor door opened. Amy Winehouse entered the way people enter when they don't need to enter in any particular way because their presence already precedes any gesture. She had her hair up in the characteristic high bun, a striped blouse, tight jeans, and eyes lined with that thick stroke that had become almost a cultural symbol. She was accompanied by 2 men, a producer named Marcus and an assistant carrying a bottle of wine and a notepad. She looked at Adele with the expression of someone assessing something unhurriedly. "You're the new girl," Amy said. It wasn't a question. "Adele," she replied, extending her hand. "Big fan." Amy shook her hand without ceremony. "I've heard your name. Jonathan said you have an interesting voice." Jonathan was one of the label's directors. The fact that Amy knew who he was and what he had said about Adele was simultaneously flattering and intimidating. Marcus, the producer, approached with the smile of someone about to say something he knows will create drama. Actually, Jonathan said something more specific. He said Adele has the most emotional voice he's heard since you, Amy. The silence that followed was brief but dense. Amy looked at Marcus with an expression that could have been irritation or could have been amusement. It was hard to tell with her. Then she looked back at Adele. "Is that what he said?" "I didn't say it," Adele replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He did. But you don't disagree." Amy crossed her arms, a smile appearing at the corner of her lips. "Most emotional voice since me. That's a lot for a 19-year-old girl who hasn't even released an album yet." From the corridor, 2 other sound technicians had stopped to listen. Bryce, inside the booth, had turned off the monitors and was watching through the glass window. "I have nothing to prove," Adele said calmly. "I'm just here working." "Everyone has something to prove," Amy said. "The question is whether you have the courage to do it in front of someone who will notice if you're faking it." She tilted her head slightly. "There's a piano in room B. Free tonight. What do you think about us singing together? Not a battle, just 2 singers at a piano. Let's see what happens." Adele looked at her for a moment. She thought about all the nights she had spent listening to Frank, Amy's first album, and then Back to Black, taking apart every phrase, every inflection, every moment when Amy's voice broke in a way that seemed impossible to calculate. She thought about how easy it would be to refuse, to invent a commitment, to say she was tired. She thought about how even easier it would be to accept and come out destroyed on the other side. "All right," Adele said, "but I'll need another coffee." Room B at Metropolis Studios was smaller than the others, with a black Steinway in the center and low lighting that made everything slightly cinematic. Someone had brought chairs. Gradually, without anyone having made a formal announcement, about 15 people had gathered. Technicians, assistants, a guitarist who was recording in another room and simply showed up, drawn by the rumor that had spread down the corridor like smoke. Amy sat on the piano bench. She didn't ask if anyone wanted to play. She simply sat and began playing a few chords, testing the instrument with the familiarity of someone who grew up that way. "You choose first," Amy said without looking at Adele. "Sing something. Anything." Adele stood beside the piano. She felt all the eyes on her. She felt the specific weight of being judged by someone whose opinion mattered more than that of any newspaper critic. She thought for a second, and then began to sing. She chose an old blues. Robert Johnson. "Come On in My Kitchen." A deliberate choice, not one of the songs she was recording for the album, not something people would expect from a 19-year-old. She started with her voice low, almost spoken, and gradually opened up, letting the low register appear first, and then building toward the high notes with a restraint that cost more than any open note. The room went quiet in a different way. Not the quiet of people waiting, the quiet of people truly listening. When she finished, Amy was looking at her with an expression that was hard to read. Her fingers had stopped on the keys in the middle of the second verse. "Robert Johnson," Amy said. "You're 19 years old and you chose Robert Johnson." "My mother listened to a lot of blues," Adele said. "Good choice of mother." Amy turned to the piano. "Now me." What Amy Winehouse did in the next 3 minutes was the reason no one in that room ever forgot that night. She didn't sing one of her own songs. She didn't sing anything from the album that had sold millions of copies. She sang "Ain't No Sunshine" by Bill Withers, but not in any way anyone had sung it before. She completely dismantled the song, stripping away all ornamentation, singing each phrase with such absolute nakedness that it felt as though the words were being said for the first time, as if Bill Withers had written them specifically for that moment in that room on that Thursday night. When Amy reached the repeated part, "I know, I know, I know," she didn't do what everyone does. She didn't speed it up, didn't dramatize it. She sang it slowly, each repetition slightly different from the previous one, in something impossible to describe technically, but impossible not to notice, as if each "I know" were a different layer of understanding of the same kind of pain. Adele stood less than 2 meters from the piano and felt something that rarely happens between musicians, especially young musicians full of ego and the necessary ambition. She felt genuine humility. Not the performative humility of someone being polite, the real humility of someone in the presence of something that surpasses them. When Amy finished, the room remained silent for a moment too long to be comfortable. "That's not fair," Adele said finally. Amy turned to her. "What?" "Singing like that. It's not fair to the rest of us." Amy looked at her for an instant and then laughed. Not the calculated laugh of someone accepting a compliment. The genuine laugh of someone caught off guard by an honesty she hadn't expected. "Sit here," Amy said, sliding over on the piano bench to make space. Adele sat beside her. 2 people on a bench made for one. "I'm going to show you something," Amy said, and began playing a simple chord. "When you sing this note, where do you feel it?" Adele sang the note. "In my chest, I think." "No, lower. Let the air drop further before you release it." Amy sang the same note, and there was a difference, not in volume, not exactly in tone, but in weight, as if the note had roots. They stayed like that for 40 minutes. It wasn't a competition, it wasn't a masterclass. It was something more organic and rarer. 2 musicians genuinely curious about each other, discovering they had more in common than the marketing of their respective worlds suggested. Marcus, the producer, tried at some point to suggest they record it. Amy silenced him with a look. "This isn't for recording. This is for happening." Around 10:30 at night, someone brought more wine. The room had thinned out a bit. People with other commitments had left, but about 8 still remained, sitting on chairs or on the floor, listening to the 2 of them talk and occasionally sing loose phrases from songs they recognized or didn't recognize. "Why did you choose the blues?" Amy asked at some point, not specifically about that night, but more broadly. "You could have gone straight pop. Your voice can handle pop." "Straight pop is easier to ignore," Adele said. "Blues stays." Amy considered this. "That's a good answer. Wrong, but good." "Wrong how?" "Straight pop stays too. It just stays differently." Amy flipped through the pages of a notepad that was on the piano, scribbles of lyrics, chords noted cryptically. "The problem isn't the genre. It's the intention. You can sing anything and make it stay, as long as you're saying something true. The problem is that most people don't know what's true for them. They sing what they think they should feel instead of what they actually feel." Adele was quiet for a moment. Did you always know what was true for you? Amy looked at the piano instead of at Adele. No, I know what's true for me when I'm singing. Outside of that, it's complicated. She said it in a simple way, without drama, without asking for sympathy, the way someone makes an observation about the weather. Adele didn't reply, but she stored that sentence with the care of someone who knows she will need it later. Around midnight, Amy got up from the piano bench with the naturalness of someone ending a business meeting. She gathered her things, said something quietly to Marcus, and then turned to Adele with that same evaluative expression from before, but different now. Less testing, more recognizing. "Jonathan wasn't wrong," Amy said. "You have something." A pause. "It's not the same as what I have, but it doesn't need to be." Adele kept looking at her. "Thank you. That means a lot." "It wasn't a complete compliment," Amy said, the corner lip smile appearing again. "It was an observation, but you can take it as a compliment if you want." She picked up the remaining bottle of wine, handed it to the assistant, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped without fully turning. "That note you couldn't get lower. Practice. You'll get there." And then she left. Bryce, who had remained silent in the booth all that night, came out and sat in the chair near Adele. They stayed quiet for a while. "That was," Bryce began, and then stopped because there wasn't a good word. "I know," Adele said. She stayed in the studio until 2 in the morning, not recording, just sitting with the cold coffee and the sheet music she had brought in her pocket and hadn't yet touched. She thought about what Amy had said about truth and intention. She thought about the way Amy had dismantled Ain't No Sunshine and rebuilt it into something that felt completely new without changing a single word. She thought about the note she needed to practice. When the album 19 came out in 2008, there was a track called Chasing Pavements that critics described in various ways. Emotionally direct, vocally mature beyond her age, a voice that carries weight without needing volume. Adele never said publicly where part of that sound had come from, but Bryce knew, and Marcus knew, and the 8 people who had stayed in that room late knew. When Amy Winehouse died in July 2011, Adele was in the middle of a tour that had turned 21 into one of the best-selling albums of all time. She learned of the news in a hotel in Manchester at 7 in the morning, over the phone. She canceled the interview she had that day and stayed in her room for hours. She gave only one public statement during that period. Short, without rhetoric, without the press release language that dominates Hollywood death announcements. She said that Amy had been one of the greatest artists she had ever seen up close, and that there was a certain note she had finally managed to reach, and that every time she reached that note, she thought of the night Amy had shown her where to look for it. No one in the press knew exactly what she was talking about, but it was enough that she knew. And it was enough that that night at Metropolis Studios had happened the way it did. Not as a battle, not as a competition, but as 2 people discovering that genuine respect is rarer and more valuable than any victory could be. The piano in Room B was still there years later. No one had changed anything significant in that studio. Technicians who worked there sometimes told the story to new artists who arrived nervous and full of doubts about whether they had what it took. They told about the 2 of them, about Robert Johnson's blues, about Ain't No Sunshine dismantled and rebuilt into something impossible to describe, about the note Amy had taught and Adele had practiced until she reached it. And invariably, the part the new artists kept wasn't the part about talent or technique. It was the part about truth, singing what you really feel instead of what you think you should feel. It was simple enough to seem obvious and difficult enough to take a lifetime to learn. Some nights produce songs, others produce musicians. That Thursday in October in Chiswick had produced something harder to name and more enduring than any album track could be. It had produced the understanding, passed from one to the other like passing a note in the dark, that greatness is not competition, it is recognition, and recognition, when genuine, transforms both sides at once.